They threatened a child, leaving a note that said we wouldn't be there to protect her. They had no idea who they'd just challenged. The rumble of my Harley is usually the only thing that can quiet the noise in my head. That, and the open road. My club, the Ironclad Legion, we're not what you see in the movies. We're mostly vets, guys who found it hard to fit back into a world that felt too quiet, too clean. We found a different kind of family, one built on chrome, leather, and an unbreakable code. We were pulled over at a dusty gas station on the edge of town, grabbing smokes and cheap coffee, when I saw her. She couldn't have been more than 11. Scuffed up sneakers, a bright pink backpack with one strap torn, and eyes that were way too old for her face. She was hovering by the candy aisle, but she wasn't looking at the chocolate bars. She was looking at us. At me. I'm a big guy, 6'4", a beard down to my chest and arms covered in ink that tells the story of my life. I know I can be intimidating, so I usually just ignore the stares. But this was different. This wasn't curiosity or fear. It was desperation. My buddy, Crusher, nudged me. "Got an admirer, Grizz," he grunted, a grin splitting his face. I just shook my head and took a long drag from my cigarette, watching her through the grimy window. She took a deep breath, the kind you take before jumping into a cold lake, and walked straight out the door, right towards me. Her steps were small but determined. The 3 other guys with me went quiet, their usual loud banter dying on their lips. A little girl in a unicorn t-shirt walking purposefully into a den of leather-clad bikers isn't something you see every day. She stopped about 3 feet from my boots, her hands clutching the torn strap of her backpack so hard her knuckles were white. She had to crane her neck to look up at me. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice a tiny whisper, almost stolen by the wind. I crouched down, trying to make myself smaller, less like a mountain and more like a person. "What's up, kid? You lost?" She shook her head, a curtain of mousy brown hair falling over her eyes. "No, I live just a few blocks from here, over in the Willows." The Willows? The nice cookie-cutter part of town. White picket fences and perfectly manicured lawns. It wasn't a place you'd expect to find a kid looking this terrified. "Okay," I said slowly. "So what can I do for you?" She bit her lip, her gaze darting from my face to my bike, then back again. "I was wondering, I know this is a weird question, but could you maybe walk me home?" Crusher let out a short, surprised laugh, which he quickly stifled when I shot him a glare. I looked back at the girl. Her eyes were pleading. This wasn't a joke. This was real. "Walk you home?" I repeated, my voice softer than I intended. "Why don't you want to walk by yourself? It's broad daylight." A single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. "Because they wait for me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They wait for me after the bus drops me off. They follow me." A cold knot formed in my stomach, the kind of knot I hadn't felt since I was overseas. "Who waits for you, little one?" "The boys," she said, looking down at her worn-out sneakers. "They're older. They throw things. They say bad stuff." She looked up again, and the raw fear in her eyes hit me like a physical blow. "Please, it's just down the road. I don't want to walk past them alone today." I didn't have a sister. I didn't have a daughter. But in that moment, she was both. I stood up to my full height, my joints popping. I looked at my brothers, Crusher, Reaper, and Bones. Not a word needed to be said. They were already swinging their legs off their bikes, kicking their kickstands into place with a series of metallic clinks. "All right," I said, my voice now a low rumble. "What's your name?" "Audrey," she said. "Well, Audrey," I said, flicking my cigarette to the ground and crushing it under my boot. "Today, the Ironclad Legion is walking you home." A wave of relief washed over her face, so profound it almost buckled her knees. We walked. 4 massive leather-clad bikers flanking a little girl with a pink backpack. We must have been a hell of a sight. The suburban streets were quiet, the silence broken only by the heavy tread of our boots on the pavement. Audrey walked right beside me, so close her shoulder occasionally brushed against my leather vest. As we turned onto her street, a pristine lane of identical houses, she pointed a trembling finger. "That's my house. The one with the blue door. It looked safe. Perfect, even. A tire swing hung from a big oak tree in the front yard. Flowers bloomed in the window boxes. We walked her right up to the front porch. She fumbled with her keys, finally getting the door open. She turned back to us, a small, watery smile on her face. "Thank you," she said. "Really." "Any time, Audrey. You stay safe," I told her, feeling an unfamiliar swell of protectiveness. We were about to turn and leave when it happened. A sharp crack echoed down the street, followed by the sickening thud of something heavy hitting the siding of her house, right next to the front window. Audrey screamed and jumped back inside, slamming the door. We all spun around, eyes scanning the street. Down at the end of the block, 3 figures on bicycles, teenagers by the look of them, laughed and sped off around the corner. Bones ran over to where the object had hit. It was a rock, a big one. But that wasn't all. Wrapped around it with a rubber band was a folded, dirty piece of paper. He untangled it and read it, his face hardening into a granite mask. He looked up at me, his eyes blazing with a cold fire I knew all too well. He didn't have to say a word. He just handed me the note. My blood ran cold as I read the crude, pencil-scrawled words. "We saw you with your new friends, little rat. Let's see if they can be there to protect you tomorrow." The paper crinkled in my grip. A red haze threatened to cloud my vision, the kind of rage that burns cold and sharp, the kind I'd learned to control in the deserts of Afghanistan. But this was different. This wasn't a soldier with a gun. This was a child in her own front yard. I looked at the note again. "Let's see if they can be there to protect you tomorrow." It wasn't just a threat. It was a challenge. And they had no idea who they'd just challenged. Crusher let out a low growl that sounded like gravel in a cement mixer. "Grizz," he started, his hand already balling into a fist the size of a small ham. "I know," I cut him off, my voice dangerously calm. I walked back up the porch steps, the crumpled note in my hand, and knocked on the blue door. It was a firm, steady knock. Not angry, not panicked. Solid. After a moment, the door opened a crack, a security chain still in place. A woman's frightened eyes peered out. Audrey's mother, I presumed. She looked from my face to Crusher's to the other two, and her face went pale. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice even. "My name is Grizz. We just walked your daughter, Audrey, home. We're not here to cause any trouble, but this was just thrown at your house." I held up the note and the rock. Her hand flew to her mouth, and I saw her eyes well up. She fumbled with the chain and opened the door. "Please come in," she whispered. The inside of the house was spotless, smelling of cinnamon and clean laundry. It was a world away from the dusty, gas-scented life I lived. Audrey was huddled on the sofa, wrapped in a crocheted afghan, her small body shaking with silent sobs. A man, presumably her father, stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, looking utterly lost. He was a man in a polo shirt and slacks, a man who probably went to an office every day and had no idea how to deal with the kind of ugly that had just landed on his doorstep. They've been doing this for months," the mother, who introduced herself as Sarah, said, her voice trembling. "We've been to the school. We've talked to their parents. We even called the police last week when they broke her bike lock. They just say it's kids being kids, that they can't do anything unless someone gets physically hurt." The father, David, looked at me, his eyes filled with a desperate mix of anger and helplessness. "I've tried to follow them. I've tried to talk to them. They just laugh and ride away. I don't know what to do anymore. My daughter is terrified to leave the house." I looked at Audrey, crying into the sofa cushions, and the cold knot in my stomach tightened into a block of ice. This wasn't about a stolen lunch or a few mean words. This was systematic torment. And the system, the people who were supposed to protect this little girl, had failed her. They had told her she was on her own. I looked at her father. I saw the shame in his eyes, the feeling of a man who couldn't protect his own family. I knew that feeling. Every soldier does. The feeling of being powerless against an enemy you can't quite get your hands on. "They won't get away with it tomorrow," I said. It wasn't a promise. It was a statement of fact. I turned to my brothers. "Wait here." I stepped back out onto the manicured lawn. the setting sun casting long shadows across the perfect green grass. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice. "Preacher," a gravelly voice answered. "It's Grizz." "Trouble?" Preacher was the president of our club, an older guy but tougher than a $2 steak. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "We've got a situation here on the north side. A little girl, name's Audrey, being terrorized by a pack of local punks. It's bad, Preach. They've been at it for months, and nobody's done a damn thing." I paused, taking a breath. "Tonight they escalated. They threw a rock at her house right in front of us, left a note saying we wouldn't be here to protect her tomorrow." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and resonant, like the first rumble of an earthquake. "They threatened a child under the Legion's watch. They put our name on it." "That's how I read it," I confirmed. "What time does this little girl go to school, Grizz?" "Bus picks her up at the corner of Willow and Oak at 7:45 a.m. "The Legion will be there," Preacher said, and the line went dead. I put the phone back in my pocket. I knew what that call meant. I knew the chain of events I had just set in motion. The parents thought they were getting 4 bikers to help their daughter. They had no idea. As I stood there, a strange quiet settling over the suburban street, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text, a mass text from Preacher, sent out to the entire regional chapter. I opened it. The message was simple, stark, and powerful. "Roll call, Dawn Patrol, corner of Willow and Oak, 7:30 am sharp. A lioness cub is threatened." Then Crusher's phone buzzed from inside the house, then Bones, then Reaper's. A digital chain reaction, spreading out through the darkness across 3 counties. It was the signal, the quiet hum before the roar. A promise of the real thunder that was coming with the sunrise. I walked back inside, the chill of the evening air clinging to my leather vest. David and Sarah looked at me, their faces a canvas of fear and confusion. David stood up, his hands clenched at his sides. "What was that? What's going to happen?" I looked from him to his wife, who was now stroking Audrey's hair as the little girl cried herself to sleep on the sofa. "I made a call," I said, my voice low and steady, "to our president." I took a step closer, making sure they understood. "You've tried talking. You've tried the school. You've tried the police. You've done everything the right way, and it hasn't worked. The Legion, we have a different way of handling things." Sarah's eyes were wide. "What are you going to do? I don't want any violence, they're just kids." "Ma'am," I interrupted as gently as I could, "the only thing that's going to happen is that your daughter is going to get on her school bus tomorrow morning without being afraid. I promise you that." There wasn't much more to say. We didn't leave. The 4 of us sat watch on their porch through the night. We drank the coffee Sarah brought out in delicate porcelain mugs that looked ridiculous in our scarred hands. We were silent sentinels in a world that wasn't ours, watching over a family that had been let down by everyone else. As the night deepened, the perfect suburban silence was broken only by the chirping of crickets and the occasional quiet murmur between me and my brothers. The first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and soft gray. The streetlights on Willow Street clicked off one by one, surrendering to the new day. It was peaceful, deceptively so. At 7:15 a.m. I heard it, a low, persistent hum, almost imperceptible at first. It was a vibration you felt deep in your chest before you could actually hear it. David came out onto the porch, pulling his robe tight. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his brow furrowed. I took a final sip of my coffee and stood up, stretching my stiff back. I nodded toward the end of the long, tree-lined street. "That," I said, a slow grin spreading across my face, "is the cavalry." The hum grew into a rumble, then a roar. A single piercing headlight cut through the morning mist. Then it was joined by 2 more. Within minutes, the sound was an all-consuming, ground-shaking thunder that vibrated through the very foundation of the house. They poured onto Willow Street, a torrent of chrome and steel. They came from the east, and they came from the west, converging on Audrey's block. Harleys, Indians, custom choppers, an endless river of iron. But this wasn't chaos. This was precision. They moved with a discipline I hadn't seen since my last tour. 2 by 2, they formed perfect, silent lines on either side of the road, creating a wide, clear corridor down the middle of the street. The path led directly from Audrey's front walk to the bus stop on the corner. Men and women, their faces hard and set, their vests bearing the ironclad Legion crest, cut their engines in a staggered, rolling wave of silence. Soon the only sound was the metallic ticking of hundreds of cooling engines and the nervous chirping of birds. Neighbors peered through their blinds. A few brave souls in bathrobes stepped onto their own porches, their mouths hanging open in stunned disbelief. I saw patches from every chapter in the state. Preacher was at the front of the line, sitting astride his gleaming black Road King. He caught my eye and gave me a single, slow, deliberate nod. The front door creaked open behind me. Sarah led Audrey out, her hand resting protectively on her daughter's shoulder. Audrey stopped dead on the top step, her little hand flying up to cover her mouth. Her pink backpack seemed like the only spot of color in a world of black leather and shining chrome. She stared at the sea of bikers, at the hundreds of solemn faces staring right back at her. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of awe and fear, found mine. I knelt down, bringing myself to her level. "We told you we'd be here, kid," I rumbled softly. "The whole Legion." A tiny smile touched her lips. Then, from around the corner, we heard it. The sound of cheap bicycle chains rattling, punctuated by the loud, obnoxious laughter of teenage boys. 3 figures on BMX bikes came whipping around onto Willow Street, heading right for the bus stop, completely oblivious. Their laughter echoed in the unnatural quiet. They were still joking, still high on their own petty power, when the leader looked up. He slammed on his brakes, his back tire skidding loudly on the pavement. His 2 friends crashed into him from behind in a tangle of limbs and metal. They froze. Their cocky grins vanished, replaced by pale, slack-jawed shock. They stared down the 100-yard gauntlet of 400 silent bikers, a human corridor of leather and steel. And at the far end of that corridor, standing on her porch like a tiny, avenging queen, was the little girl they had come to torment. The silence on Willow Street was absolute, a heavy blanket broken only by the frantic, panicked breathing of the 3 teenage boys. They were caught, pinned by the weight of 100 silent judgments. Their faces, which had been twisted with arrogant cruelty just moments before, were now stark white masks of pure terror. They didn't look at us, the bikers. They couldn't. Their eyes were locked on Audrey, this small child who had somehow summoned an army. Then, with a creak of leather, Preacher swung his leg off his bike. He didn't stomp, he didn't stride. He just walked, his worn boots making almost no sound on the asphalt. He moved with a kind of predatory grace that made the air feel thick and heavy. He stopped directly in front of the boys, who flinched as if he'd struck them. He was shorter than me, but he had an aura of command that could make a general stand at attention. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "I think you boys took a wrong turn," he said, his voice a low, calm rumble. The lead boy, the one who had been laughing the loudest, just stared, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. Preacher gestured with his chin down the long corridor of bikes and bikers. "This is Audrey's street now. And you see all these people?" He paused, letting them soak in the sheer, overwhelming scale of it all. "We're her new neighbors, all of us." He took one more step, invading their personal space, forcing them to look at him. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to turn your little bikes around, you're going to go home, and you're going to forget Audrey's name. You will forget her address. You will never look at her, speak to her, or even breathe in her direction again. Because if you do, we'll know, and we'll come have another, less friendly, chat. Do we have an understanding?" The boy could only manage a series of frantic, jerky nods, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it was almost pitiful. His friends were frozen solid behind him. Preacher held their gaze for a long moment, then turned his back on them, a gesture of complete and utter dismissal. He walked back to his bike and nodded once to me. It was time. I turned to Audrey, who was still standing on the top step, her eyes like saucers. I held out my scarred, calloused hand. "Ready to go to school?" I asked. She looked at my hand, then up at my face, and the last of her fear seemed to melt away, replaced by a dazzling, brilliant smile. She didn't just take my hand, she gripped it like a lifeline. We walked down the steps together, her small hand swallowed up in mine. As our feet hit the pavement, a sound started at the far end of the street. It was the sound of a single Harley engine turning over, a deep, guttural vroom. Then another and another and another, a wave of sound that followed us as we walked. We walked down the center of that corridor of chrome and leather. No one said a word. But as we passed, helmets came off. Heads nodded in respect. It wasn't for me. It was for her. It was a procession, a coronation. They were honoring her courage. She walked with her head held high, her pink backpack a defiant banner in the morning sun. Her steps were sure and steady. This wasn't the scared little girl from the gas station. This was Audrey, the girl who had a legion at her back. When we reached the bus stop, the big yellow bus was just pulling up, its brakes hissing. The bus driver, a woman with graying hair, stared out the window, her face a perfect picture of stunned amazement. Audrey let go of my hand and turned to face me. "Grizz?" she said, her voice clear and strong. "Yeah, kid." She threw her arms around my waist, burying her face in my leather vest. "Thank you," she whispered. I awkwardly patted her back, my hand feeling huge and clumsy against her small frame. "Any time, little lioness," I rumbled. "Any time." She let go, ran up the steps of the bus, and took a seat right by the window. As the bus doors closed and it pulled away, she pressed her hand against the glass. I raised my own in a final farewell. We stood there, all of us, until the bus was completely out of sight. Then, Preacher gave the signal. The roar became deafening as 400 engines fired up in unison. With the same discipline they had shown on arrival, the ironclad legion peeled off, 2 by 2, and thundered away, leaving Willow Street in a silence that felt deeper and more peaceful than before. A week later, a package arrived at our clubhouse. It was addressed to me. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a framed picture. It was a drawing done in crayon. It showed a huge bearded biker with a smiley face, holding the hand of a little girl with a pink backpack. They were surrounded by hundreds of other motorcycles, all drawn with careful, loving detail. Taped to the bottom was a note written in a child's neat script. It said, "You're all my heroes. Love, Audrey." We hung that picture right in the center of our clubhouse wall, next to the photos of brothers we'd lost, because the Ironclad Legion has a code, one that isn't written down in any book. It's a code of loyalty, of honor, and of protecting those who can't protect themselves. And on that quiet suburban morning, a little girl named Audrey reminded all 400 of us exactly what that code means.